Some Christians are not financially controlled by greed. They are financially controlled by fear, shame, and a belief that having less makes them more righteous. They stay stuck because they are afraid of what money might mean about them. Afraid that charging fairly will make them greedy. Afraid that wanting financial stability is evidence that their heart is in the wrong place. So they call under-earning humility and call avoidance waiting on God. And without realizing it, they create a religious explanation for remaining stuck. Now, let me be very clear. Poverty is not always the result of poor choices. People can be financially struggling because of low wages, illness, disability, discrimination, debt, family responsibilities, divorce, unemployment, economic conditions, or systems designed to benefit from their vulnerability. So, this is not a message telling every financially struggling Christian, "You are the problem." Sometimes the problem is an unjust system. Sometimes the problem is that there simply is not enough income coming in. But there are also moments when our beliefs make it harder to respond wisely to the situation we are in. And that is the part we need to examine. Because some Christians have not simply inherited financial hardship. They have inherited a theology of limitation. A set of beliefs that quietly tells them, do not want too much. Do not charge too much. Do not become too successful. And here is the uncomfortable question. What if money is controlling you? Not because you are chasing it, but because you are afraid of it? Jesus said in Matthew 6:24, "You cannot serve both God and money." We usually hear that as a warning against greed. And it is. But money can become your master through fear just as easily as through desire. If money determines what you will attempt, what you will tolerate, what you will refuse to ask for, and what you believe you are allowed to receive, then money is still directing your life. Today, I want to show you Christian beliefs that can sound spiritual, but can quietly become financial handcuffs. Not with a prosperity gospel. Not with the promise that everyone who has enough faith will become wealthy, but with a more honest question. What does biblical faith actually require from us when it comes to earning, receiving, planning, giving, and growing? Welcome to Scriptora Faith Haven. If you want conversations about faith that can hold both truth and nuance, without reducing every problem to a slogan, subscribe to this channel, because we are not here to make you feel guilty for being where you are. We are here to help you understand what may be keeping you there, and what God may be inviting you to change. Let's begin with one of the most respectable financial beliefs in Christian culture. Maybe God is keeping me poor so I can stay humble. It sounds spiritual. It sounds like a way to protect your heart from greed. But it confuses two completely different things. Humility is a posture toward God. Poverty is an economic condition. They are not the same thing. A person can have very little and still be proud. A person can have significant resources and still be humble. Money does not automatically produce arrogance, and poverty does not automatically produce holiness. In fact, when we treat financial lack as a sign of spiritual purity, we place a moral label on a painful condition. We start assuming that people with less are more faithful, and people with more are automatically more corrupt. That is not biblical discernment. That is moralizing someone's bank account. Deuteronomy 8:18 says, "Remember the Lord your God, for it is He who gives you the ability to produce wealth." Now, this verse is not a promise that every faithful Christian will become rich. That would be an irresponsible reading of Scripture. The context is actually a warning. God tells Israel not to become proud and forget Him when they enter a place of abundance. So the principle is not, every believer will be wealthy. The principle is that ability, opportunity, skill, and productive capacity are gifts that should never be separated from God. The warning is not against having resources. The warning is against forgetting who gave you the capacity to create them. That means wealth can be a temptation, but it can also be a responsibility. It can fund generosity. It can create jobs. It can give you the freedom to respond when someone needs help. The question is not simply, how much do I have? The deeper question is, what happens in my heart when I have it? This is where psychology becomes useful. Many people carry what therapists and financial counselors call money scripts. These are invisible rules about money that we learned early in life. For example, people with money cannot be trusted. Wanting more makes you selfish. Financial struggle is proof that you are humble. People like us never get ahead. Most people do not consciously choose these beliefs. They absorb them from family, church culture, painful experiences, or the behavior of people who had money and used it badly. But an unconscious belief can still direct your decisions. If you believe money makes people evil, you may unconsciously reject opportunities that would increase your income. Not because you do not need the money, because you do not want to become the kind of person you associate with money. You create what we might call a sacred ceiling. You are willing to have enough to survive, but not enough to feel powerful, not enough to be noticed, not enough to challenge your identity. So ask yourself honestly, would I still call this humility if I were talking about someone I love? Would I call it faith if it were preventing me from caring for my family? Humility does not say, I must remain small. Humility says, whatever I receive is not ultimately mine, so I must handle it faithfully. That is a very different mindset. And if this is already giving language to something you have felt, but never been able to explain, take a moment to like this video. Also, tell me in the comments, what is one sentence about money that you heard repeatedly growing up? Not what you currently believe, what you were taught. Because sometimes, the first step toward financial freedom is discovering which beliefs were never truly ours. The second phrase is, I'm waiting on God. Sometimes, that is exactly what faith requires. There are seasons when the answer is not available yet. There are doors that should not be forced. There are situations where patience is obedience. But waiting on God and avoiding responsibility are not the same thing. Proverbs 21:5 says, the plans of the diligent lead surely to abundance, but everyone who is hasty comes only to poverty. Notice the balance. The verse does not praise frantic activity. It praises diligence and planning. It also warns against haste. Biblical wisdom is not passive, but it is not reckless either. It is thoughtful. It is intentional. It is willing to take the next step without pretending to know every step after that. Here is the question. What are you calling waiting that God may be calling preparation? Are you waiting on God? Or are you waiting to feel completely confident? Are you waiting on God? Or are you avoiding your bank account because the numbers make you anxious? There is a psychological reason people avoid financial action. Avoidance gives you immediate emotional relief. You do not open the bill so you feel better for the next 10 minutes. You do not apply for the position so you do not have to face rejection. You do not ask for the raise so you do not have to hear no. But the relief is temporary. The problem remains. And the brain learns, avoiding this makes me feel safer. Over time, avoidance becomes a habit. Then we add religious language to the habit. I'm trusting God. I'm waiting for the right time. If it is meant to be, God will open the door. But sometimes a door is open and we are standing outside, asking God for a sign because we are afraid to enter. Faith does not mean you control the outcome. Faith means you are willing to participate in obedience before you have a guarantee. A job application can be an act of faith. Learning a skill can be an act of faith. Paying attention to your expenses can be an act of faith. Creating a debt plan can be an act of faith. Prayer is not a substitute for a plan, and a plan is not a substitute for prayer. You need both. If your financial prayer is always, Lord, send me money, perhaps the next prayer should be, Lord, show me what I need to learn, change, build, ask, or release. Because provision does not always arrive as a sudden deposit. Sometimes it arrives as an idea, a skill, a connection, a warning, a budget, a boundary, a decision you have been postponing. And if God provides through ordinary means, we should not reject the provision simply because it requires our participation. The third belief sounds very mature. I should just be content with what I have. Contentment is biblical, but contentment is often misunderstood. Paul writes in Philippians 4 verse 11, I have learned in whatever situation I am to be content. Pay attention to the word learned. Paul did not say contentment was his automatic emotional response. He learned it, and he learned it in both abundance and need. A few verses later, he says he knows what it is to have plenty and what it is to be hungry. So when Paul says, I can do all things through Christ, he is not saying, I can achieve every financial dream I have. He is saying that through Christ, he can remain faithful in changing circumstances. Contentment does not mean pretending that need does not matter. It means your identity is not destroyed by what you currently lack. But there is a difference between contentment and resignation. Contentment says, I am grateful for what I have, and I am willing to grow wisely. Resignation says, nothing can change, so there is no point trying. Contentment says, I do not need a luxury purchase to prove my worth. Resignation says, my needs and desires do not matter. Contentment gives you freedom from obsession. Resignation removes your expectation of growth. One is peace. The other is surrendering your agency. This is important because Christians sometimes use contentment to shame healthy desire. Wanting to become debt-free is not automatically greed. Wanting a safe home is not automatically greed. Wanting to earn enough to rest, give, create, or care for your family is not automatically greed. Desire becomes dangerous when it becomes the source of your identity, your security, or your value. But desire itself is not the enemy. The question is whether your desire is being governed by wisdom and love. A person can desire more money because they want to impress people. Another person can desire more money because they want to leave an abusive job, support their children, help their parents, or create something useful, the amount may look similar from the outside. The motive is different. So do not use the word contentment to avoid asking whether your current situation is healthy, sustainable, or aligned with your responsibilities. You can be thankful and still make a plan. You can be peaceful and still pursue a better opportunity. You can trust God and still admit that the current arrangement is not working. Now we come to a problem that is rarely discussed directly. Some Christians have become very easy to underpay. They work hard. They deliver value. They solve problems. They carry responsibilities. But the moment compensation comes up, they become uncomfortable. They say, "I don't want to be greedy. I just want to serve. I would rather keep it affordable. I feel bad asking for more." There is nothing wrong with serving. There is nothing wrong with affordability. But if you consistently give away your labor, accept unfair compensation, or refuse to negotiate because you are afraid of appearing spiritual enough, that may not be humility. It may be a lack of boundaries. Jesus said in Luke 10:7, "The laborer deserves his wages." That does not mean every price is justified. It does not mean Christians should manipulate, exploit, or charge people unfairly. It means labor has value, time has value, skill has value, responsibility has value. The Bible does not teach that a worker becomes more holy by being permanently underpaid. Ephesians 4:28 gives a surprisingly practical reason for work. Let the thief no longer steal, but rather let him labor, doing honest work with his own hands, so that he may have something to share with anyone in need. The purpose of earning is not only personal comfort, it is also the capacity to share. If your income is so low that you cannot care for your responsibilities, recover from emergencies, or be generous without entering crisis, then increasing your earning capacity may actually support your values. You do not have to choose between being faithful and being financially capable. But there is a psychological layer here too. Some people undercharge because they believe receiving creates obligation. If someone pays them properly, they feel exposed. They feel they have to prove themselves, so they keep their price low enough to avoid criticism. Others undercharge because they are afraid of rejection. If the price is low, perhaps people will not leave. Some undercharge because they have confused being needed with being loved. They give endlessly because usefulness has become their way of securing belonging. That is not generosity anymore. That is people-pleasing wearing a Christian vocabulary. Jesus served people deeply, but Jesus did not allow every demand to control his schedule. He withdrew to pray. He left crowds. He understood that love without boundaries eventually becomes resentment. So ask yourself, am I offering this freely? Or am I afraid to ask for what it is worth? Fair compensation is not greed. Greed is taking more than is right because you are ruled by accumulation. Fair compensation is receiving enough to sustain the work, honor the agreement, and fulfill your responsibilities. You are allowed to grow in skill. You are allowed to improve your income. You are allowed to stop treating exhaustion as proof of character. Now we need to address giving carefully, because many Christians have been taught to think about generosity in a transactional way. I give this amount, and God must return more. That can sound like faith, but underneath it, money is still in control. You are not giving freely. You are trying to purchase security through a spiritual transaction. 2 Corinthians 9:7 says, "Each one must give as he has decided in his heart, not reluctantly or under compulsion, for God loves a cheerful giver." Not manipulated, not publicly pressured or financially coerced. Cheerful, free, intentional. The New Testament does not present giving as a way to force God's hand. God is not a vending machine. You do not insert an offering and demand a financial return. Giving is worship. It is participation. It is a way of loosening the grip of selfishness and remembering that our resources are not our identity. But generosity is not the same as financial self-destruction. 1 Timothy 5:8 says that anyone who does not provide for their own household has denied the faith. That means responsibilities matter. Rent matters. Food matters. Medical care matters. The needs of people who depend on you matter. A parent who refuses to buy groceries in order to make a pressured church donation is not automatically showing greater faith. And a ministry that uses fear to extract money from people in crisis is not automatically teaching generosity. In Acts 5, Peter says to Ananias, "While it remained unsold, did it not remain your own?" The point is powerful. The early church practiced radical generosity, but the generosity was not based on pretending people had no agency. There was no deception, no forced performance. This also matters psychologically. Some people give because they genuinely love. Others give because they cannot tolerate disappointing people. They give to avoid guilt. They give because they are afraid that saying no will make them look selfish or unspiritual. That is not freedom. That is approval seeking. A healthy giver can say yes with joy and no without shame. A healthy giver understands that giving to one person does not mean agreeing to every request from every person. If you are in financial crisis, generosity may need to look different for a season. It may be time, meals, encouragement, practical service, prayer, or sharing resources you genuinely have. Do not let anyone convince you that the only evidence of faith is handing over money you need for survival. And do not let fear of manipulation turn you into someone who never gives. The goal is not extreme giving or extreme withholding. The goal is faithful stewardship. If this distinction is different from what you usually hear, subscribe to Scriptora Faith Haven. I would love for you to be part of our early subscribers in this community. Here is another mistake we must avoid. Sometimes financial teaching becomes cruel because it treats every struggle as a personal mindset problem. Someone is underpaid, and we tell them to budget harder. Someone is disabled, and we tell them to have more faith. Someone is working full-time and still cannot afford housing, and we give them a motivational quote. That is not wisdom. That is dismissal. A budget cannot create income that does not exist. Positive thinking cannot erase discrimination. A prayer cannot be used as an excuse to ignore exploitation. The Bible does not place all responsibility on the individual. James 2 describes a person who lacks clothing and daily food. The Christian response is not to say, "I hope things improve." The response is tangible care. James asks what good it is to offer spiritual words without meeting practical needs. In Acts 4, the early church is described as a community where there was no needy person among them. That does not mean every believer had identical income. It means the community refused to treat severe need as someone else's problem. This is part of the biblical picture that many financial conversations ignore. There is personal stewardship, but there is also communal responsibility. There are personal choices, but there are also wages, laws, systems, opportunity, inheritance, geography, health, and social support. So if you are financially struggling, do not automatically assume you are being punished by God. And do not automatically assume you are lazy. But also do not use the reality of systems as a reason to surrender every area of personal agency. Both things can be true. You may be facing conditions you did not create, and still have choices about your next step. Your circumstances may explain your struggle, but they do not have to become your identity. Context matters, but context is not destiny. Before you say, "I need more faith," identify what kind of financial problem you actually have. Because different problems require different responses. First, is there an income problem? If there is genuinely not enough money coming in, the answer is not simply to cut more spending. You may need a better paying role, training, negotiation, a second income stream, assistance, community support, or a change in your working situation. There is a difference between overspending and insufficient income. Do not confuse them. Second, is there a visibility problem? Some people have no idea where their money is going, not because they are evil, because looking at the numbers triggers shame. They avoid the account, and the lack of information makes every decision worse. The first step is not judgment. It is visibility. Look at the last 30 days. Name what came in. Name what went out. Do not call yourself stupid. Do not call yourself hopeless. Gather information. You cannot steward what you refuse to see. Third, is there a debt problem? Debt changes the future by taking money from tomorrow and spending it today. Proverbs 22:7 says, "The borrower is the slave of the lender." That is not a sentence of condemnation. It is a description of pressure. If debt is controlling you, you may need a repayment strategy, negotiation, financial counseling, or help restructuring your obligations. You do not need more shame. You need a plan. Fourth, is there an emotional regulation problem? Some people spend when they feel rejected. Some give money because they are afraid of being abandoned. Some make impulsive financial decisions after a stressful day because purchasing creates a momentary sense of control. That is not solved by a spreadsheet alone. You may need to understand the emotion that comes before the financial behavior. What are you trying to feel? Relief? Approval? Safety? Freedom? Comfort? The purchase may not be the real issue. The emotional wound underneath it may be. Fifth, is there a capacity problem? Maybe you are faithful, hardworking, and disciplined, but your current skills are not producing enough income for the future you are responsible for. That is not a character failure, but it may be an invitation to grow, learn, ask questions, develop a skill, improve your communication, build relationships, seek better opportunities. Not because your worth depends on earning more, because your responsibilities may require greater capacity. This is why pray harder is not always a complete financial strategy. Sometimes the next spiritual step is education. Sometimes it is admitting that the way you have been operating is no longer sustainable. Here is a simple exercise I want you to do this week. Write down this sentence. Money is. Then finish it 10 different ways. Money is dangerous. Money is freedom. Money is embarrassing. Money is proof that I am successful. Money is something Christians should not care about. Money is security. Money is responsibility. Money is conflict. Money is a way to help people. Money is never enough. Do not edit yourself. Just write. Then look at the sentences and ask, which of these beliefs came from Scripture? Which came from fear? Which came from my family? Which came from a painful experience? Which one is currently shaping my decisions? Then choose one practical action. Not 10. 1. Open the account you have been avoiding. Apply for the position. Ask what your work is worth. Cancel the recurring expense. Schedule a conversation with a qualified financial counselor. Set a boundary around lending. Create a realistic giving plan. Learn the skill you keep saying you will learn. And then, tell one trustworthy person what you are doing. Shame grows in secrecy. Wisdom grows in honest community. If this conversation has helped you separate conviction from shame, share it with someone who needs a more balanced approach to faith and money. And subscribe if you want more content that does not treat complicated problems like they have one-line answers. So why do some Christians stay broke? Sometimes it is because of systems they did not create. Sometimes it is because their income is simply too low. Sometimes it is because of debt, poor decisions, lack of knowledge, or financial avoidance. And sometimes it is because they have made limitation feel holy. They have called fear faith. They have called resignation contentment. They have called unwise giving generosity. The answer is not to worship wealth, and it is not to worship poverty either. The answer is to become faithful with reality, to see clearly, to tell the truth, to plan without pretending you control the future, to grow without believing growth makes you better than anyone else. Your goal is not to become rich so people will admire you. Your goal is to become free enough to obey God, care for the people entrusted to you, give with joy, rest without panic, and use what you have for something larger than yourself. So, here is the question I want you to sit with. Where has money become a theology in my life? What does your financial behavior say you believe about God, about yourself, about work, about receiving, about generosity, about what you are allowed to want? Do not answer quickly. Let the question follow you into prayer. And when you discover the belief that has been keeping you small, do not respond with shame. Respond with truth. Then take the next honest step. If this video gave you a new way to understand your financial life, leave a comment with the sentence you are choosing to release. Not the amount of money you want, the belief you are letting go of. And if you want more conversations that challenge religious assumptions while keeping Christ at the center, subscribe to Scriptora Faith Haven. Because financial freedom is not only about having more money, it is also about no longer allowing fear, shame, greed, or guilt to tell you what you are permitted to do with it.